The layers of duplicity and shallowness. This is a new low.
What's happened with Andrew losing his title and now her losing Duchess of York, it just proves that the York brand is totally toxic.
Pressure really mounting up on Prince Andrew, having already given up the use of his royal titles.
King Charles is battling with Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson to convince the Yorks to move out of the Royal Lodge.
Ever-evolving soap opera, that is, of course, what's happening over at Royal Lodge.
When King Charles issued a formal eviction notice ordering Andrew Mountbatten Windsor to leave the 30-room Royal Lodge mansion where he'd lived for over 2 decades, everyone expected the disgraced prince to accept his fate quietly and relocate to whatever modest property the palace offered. But instead, Andrew responded with a list of demands so bold and so extensive that palace staff described the negotiations as something from another planet. What should have been a straightforward administrative relocation turned into one of the most bizarre standoffs inside the royal family in years. And the more pressure Charles applied, the longer Andrew's list of requirements seemed to grow, transforming a simple move into a complex power struggle that revealed just how determined he remained to cling to every privilege he believed he deserved. But here's what makes this situation genuinely fascinating, and why it shook the family more than anyone anticipated. Andrew didn't just demand a replacement home. He insisted on a 6 or 7 bedroom property, fully staffed with a cook, gardener, housekeeper, and driver, plus renewed police protection. And rumors began circulating that he wasn't negotiating for just 1 property, but potentially 2, with Frogmore Cottage and a substantial residence on the Sandringham estate, both mentioned as possibilities. Once you understand why Andrew clung to his Queen Elizabeth II era lease like a lifeline, knowing it was the strongest legal card he had left, why King Charles strategically removed Andrew's privately funded security in August 2024 to increase pressure, and what insiders meant when they said this entire saga was really about money, leverage, and the quiet power struggle shaping the monarchy's future under a new reign, you'll realize this battle over bricks and mortar represented something far deeper, a test of who holds control in the new era, who lost it, and who remains determined to reclaim whatever influence they can before everything slips away permanently. For more than 2 decades, Andrew Mountbatten Windsor treated Royal Lodge as his absolutely unshakable home base, a place he genuinely believed no one would ever take from him, regardless of scandals or changing circumstances. He lived there alongside Sarah Ferguson, relying on a lease that had been carefully crafted under Queen Elizabeth II's reign, a legal document so protective of his interests that insiders often characterized it as ironclad and nearly impossible to break. But that entire sense of security vanished essentially overnight when King Charles issued a formal eviction notice shortly after ascending to the throne. What should have been a quiet administrative decision instantly transformed into something far more explosive and intensely personal. At first, the general public had absolutely no idea just how intense the situation had actually become behind palace walls. The official announcement seemed relatively straightforward and businesslike. New king, new priorities, properties being reassigned for practical reasons. But behind the scenes, staff members whispered that Royal Lodge had slipped into a genuinely worrying state of neglect over the years. Cracked walls, peeling paint, and entire sections of the estate reportedly left to deteriorate without proper maintenance. And that raised a question nobody dared voice publicly. Had the property fallen so far into disrepair that even the supposedly ironclad lease couldn't protect Andrew's position anymore? King Charles wanted Royal Lodge returned to working condition, not merely for public appearances, but for the long-term future of the family's property portfolio and how these estates would be managed going forward. Andrew, however, clung to his existing lease like a legal lifeline, determined to hold on to every protective clause and every inch of ground he could defend. This simmering tension set the stage for what would become one of the most unexpected twists in the entire saga. Because instead of quietly retreating and accepting whatever accommodation was offered, Andrew began preparing something else entirely. A counteroffer that wasn't just bold, but genuinely staggering in its scope. And once he revealed exactly what he wanted in exchange for leaving the estate, Even some of his closest supporters were taken aback by the audacity. The real shock wasn't that he refused to leave quietly. It was what he demanded as compensation. Once Andrew Mountbatten Windsor realized the eviction was absolutely inevitable, regardless of legal maneuvering, he didn't crumble under the mounting pressure. He pivoted strategically. And that's when the negotiations shifted dramatically from merely tense to genuinely astonishing. Instead of accepting whatever modest property King Charles offered as replacement housing, Andrew arrived at the negotiating table with a list of demands so extensive, so specific in detail, that staff involved in the discussions were genuinely stunned by the scope. The man losing a 31-room mansion wasn't downsizing his expectations. He was essentially demanding an upgrade in everything except square footage. The first demand alone raised eyebrows throughout palace circles. A 6 or 7 bedroom home, not a modest cottage, not a temporary residence, but a full-scale property worthy of what he believed he remained entitled to as a son of the late Queen. And this wasn't some vague general request. He wanted the property secured, renovated to acceptable standards, and legally guaranteed before he would agree to formally leave Royal Lodge. But the house itself was only the beginning of his requirements, because within days the list grew substantially longer and considerably stranger. Why was he suddenly insisting on so much? What leverage did he believe he still possessed that others didn't recognize? Next came the staffing expectations, which raised even more questions about his understanding of his changed circumstances. According to sources with direct knowledge of the talks, Andrew insisted on maintaining a full household team, including a private cook, a dedicated gardener, a housekeeper, a personal driver, and even renewed police protection at taxpayer or royal family expense. To him personally, this wasn't extravagance or unreasonable luxury. It represented what he needed to maintain what he considered a normal lifestyle, appropriate to his birth status. But to those directly involved in the negotiations, it felt like the discussions were drifting far beyond what anyone had reasonably expected, given his complete removal from official royal duties. And insiders started genuinely wondering whether this was actually a good faith negotiation or a deliberate standoff designed to drag on indefinitely while he remained at Royal Lodge. Even his remaining friends noticed the fundamental shift in his approach. One confidant reportedly claimed Andrew had done exactly what was asked of him regarding stepping back from public life and simply wanted fairness and reasonable treatment in return. But fairness is entirely subjective, and in this particular case, it depended entirely on who you asked for their perspective. Because while his allies defended his position, others closer to the palace operations saw the situation very differently. One former courtier characterized it bluntly. This was always going to ultimately come down to money and financial leverage. And that wasn't just a casual observation. It hinted at a deeper truth about how far Andrew was genuinely willing to push this confrontation. What financial pressure was really driving these extensive demands? And how much actual leverage did he think he had remaining after losing titles, patronages, and public support? But the real twist came when insiders realized just how legally precise and detailed his requests had become. Every clause, every condition, every non-negotiable item had to be examined and negotiated line by line with legal advisors. Some palace staff described the process as absolutely exhausting. Others characterized it as deliberately obstructive, because as the list grew longer, so did the institutional tension. Why was Andrew haggling over every minor detail? And what was he desperately trying to secure before everything slipped permanently beyond his control? As negotiations dragged on for months, insiders began quietly whispering about something genuinely unexpected. The possibility that Andrew Mountbatten Windsor wasn't just looking for one new residence, but potentially 2 separate properties. It started as a quiet rumor, something only a few people with inside knowledge dared to mention. But the more the official talks stalled without resolution, the more it appeared there might be substantial truth behind it. And that raised a critical question that confused observers. Why would someone losing a massive mansion suddenly need multiple properties to replace it? The first of these rumoured homes was Frogmore Cottage, the former residence of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle before they departed for California. To most outside observers, it seemed like a genuinely odd choice for Andrew. The property was smaller, less private, and loaded with uncomfortable symbolism after everything that happened with the Sussexes and their departure from royal life. But Andrew reportedly saw the situation very differently. To him personally, Frogmore wasn't primarily about comfort or living space. It was fundamentally about negotiating leverage. And some insiders genuinely believe he focused on it precisely because requesting Frogmore gave him more bargaining power in discussions than most people realized. But what kind of long-term strategy actually involves Frogmore Cottage? And why was he so intensely focused on obtaining it? Then came the second part of the rumor that circulated through palace circles, the suggestion that Sarah Ferguson had her eye on Adelaide Cottage, which had previously served as home to the Prince and Princess of Wales before they relocated. This wasn't about luxury or grandeur. It was about proximity to important family members, maintaining social reputation, and finding the stability she never quite achieved after the turbulent years following her divorce. And while Sarah stayed mostly quiet publicly, those who knew her well indicated she was watching the negotiations extremely closely, waiting for her own outcome to unfold separately from Andrew's demands. But what did she know about the situation that the public didn't? And why was Adelaide Cottage so critically important to her envisioned future? With both rumored homes floating in the background of discussions, something else happened behind the scenes that shifted the focus. Andrew began pushing aggressively for a serious, substantial property on King Charles's Sandringham estate. Not a modest space, not a temporary fix, but a significant home that matched the kind of lifestyle he believed he remained entitled to, regardless of his fallen status. Palace staff described the request as remarkably bold, given circumstances. Royal advisors characterized it as tactically calculated, because Sandringham wasn't just any estate in the royal portfolio. It was one of the very few places where privacy, physical distance from London scrutiny, and family legacy aligned perfectly. So why did Andrew suddenly see Sandringham as his next potential stronghold? And what did this reveal about his fundamental mindset going forward? But the story takes an even sharper turn when attention shifted onto Sarah Ferguson and her completely separate next move. Because while Andrew fought determinedly for larger homes and more negotiating leverage, she faced a completely different reality, one that could potentially take her somewhere almost no one expected. While Andrew Mountbatten Windsor fought for bigger properties and firmer guarantees, Sarah Ferguson's situation drifted in a completely different direction that surprised those watching closely. She maintained a deliberately low profile throughout the extended negotiations, rarely making any public comments and carefully avoiding anything that could escalate the already tense situation. But behind the scenes, those close to her indicated she was bracing for a future that looked nothing whatsoever, like the comfortable life she'd known inside Royal Lodge for years. And the quiet, dignified way she handled the uncertainty only made external speculation grow louder. The first rumor that caught people's attention was surprisingly subtle. A whisper that she might not remain anywhere near Windsor once the move finally happened. Some insiders hinted she had no interest whatsoever in returning to Frogmore or Adelaide Cottage if they were eventually offered, preferring instead to carve out an independent space of her own. But what raised genuine eyebrows was the suggestion that she might end up somewhere far more modest than anyone expected. Why would someone long accustomed to expansive royal estates suddenly consider something so dramatically reduced? That question became even more intriguing when reports surfaced about a curious option: a renovated building on Princess Beatrice's Cotswolds estate. Not a grand home, not a sprawling residence, but what some described as a former cattle shed that had been transformed into a quiet, private living space. It sounded almost unbelievable to people who remembered her past life at Royal Lodge. Yet the rumor persisted with remarkable consistency, and the tone around it hinted at something psychologically deeper. Was this potential move really about downsizing, or was it about deliberately distancing herself from the unfolding chaos surrounding Andrew? By the time negotiations reached their final stages, it became crystal clear this wasn't just about housing anymore. The entire situation had evolved into a quiet but intense power struggle, a genuine test of leverage, patience, and status inside a family trying to fundamentally redefine itself under a new king. And Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, stripped of his official roles but definitely not his determination, was standing his ground in ways few had anticipated. The question was no longer if he would eventually leave Royal Lodge, but how much he could successfully secure before the final handover occurred. Observers quickly noticed a recurring theme underlying everything: money. Not in the obvious public sense, but in the behind-the-scenes financial calculations shaping absolutely every move. Maintaining Royal Lodge had become increasingly expensive, and its documented disrepair only made the situation worse financially. Yet Andrew clung desperately to his long-standing lease, knowing it represented the strongest legal card he had remaining. Every protective clause in that contract held genuine weight, and every legal detail gave him tangible bargaining power. But what exactly did that lease protect in practical terms? And why was King Charles legally forced to respect it even as the situation escalated? The standoff deepened significantly when Charles made one of his most decisive strategic moves: the removal of Andrew's privately funded security detail in August 2024. This wasn't merely symbolic, it was strategically calculated. By eliminating a major financial cushion, Charles subtly but unmistakably increased the pressure, signaling that the era of unchecked privileges was definitively over. But instead of backing down as expected, Andrew used even this shift as another leverage point to argue for the extensive staff and protections he claimed remained essential to his safety and basic functioning. And insiders couldn't help but wonder, was this actually a negotiation or a long, deliberately calculated attempt to regain some measure of the influence he'd lost? That's it for today, folks. See you in the next video.